This is Mac OS Ken.
Positive signs for iPhone, more on Travel and Tim's China trip, and talk of possible new hardware. It is Monday, the 23rd of October, 2023. I'm Ken Ray, and this is news from Mac OS Ken, brought to you by yours truly and sponsored by Green Chef, the #1 meal kit for eating well. Go to greenchef.com/60MOK and use code 60MOK for 60% off plus free shipping. This show is also supported by people like you, patrons through Patreon. Find out more and add your support at patreon.com/MacOSKen. Most of last week was filled with tales of gloom and despair around sales of iPhone 15. Let's say we start this week with a story from last week that I missed. It's one from Barron's, indicating that strong results for AT&T are good news for Apple investors. According to the report, the Death Star beat analyst expectations by the tiniest amount. The company reported revenue of $30.4 billion, squeaking past the street's expectation of $30.2. It also reported earnings per share of 64 cents, just beating expectations of 62 cents. While the piece doesn't have AT&T giving all credit to iPhone, certainly seems to have helped. According to the report, CEO John Stankey said AT&T saw the strongest iPhone pre-orders it had in many years in September. Barron says Stankey said he didn't know whether the demand is unique to AT&T, but that the company saw customers upgrading to new iPhones at a rate higher than what it's seen in the last several quarters. The festive season in India is looking very festive for iPhone. India's Economic Times cites numbers from Counterpoint Research that show iPhone clocking 1.5 million sales in the first week of that shopping season across Flipkart and Amazon. According to the report, iPhone sales through both channels were up 25% versus the same period last year, with high demand for iPhone 12, 13, and 14. Adding a bit of perspective to those numbers, a report on them from Apple MOSK says back in 2020, Apple doubled its market share in India with 1.5 million iPhone sales in 3 months. Now it has achieved that same number in 7 days. The site says the news reflects well on the work Apple has been doing in India. That is true, no doubt, though it did have some help. The Economic Times piece says both Flipkart and Amazon rolled out their respective sales with offers that included heavy price discounts, higher trade-in values, and attractive bundle offers. Interestingly, though, that same report has Counterpoint saying online channels, which experienced slow demand throughout the year, registered a bigger than expected surge in demand, prompting them to raise prices from the third day of the sales week. And Counterpoint does not think that that will slow momentum. Quoting the firm one more time, the strong demand has set a cheerful mood for the festive season, and we believe the strong consumer sentiment will continue in offline sales as well, due to parity between offline and online discounts. It's worth noting the excitement is not limited to iPhone sales. At the broader level, the Economic Times says the festive season sales of smartphones were mainly driven by strong demand for Samsung, Apple, and Xiaomi devices, as per Counterpoint's numbers. Tim Cook's trip to China featured a few more big visits. On Saturday, the South China Morning Post had Apple CEO meeting with Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xuexiong. Not unlike last week's meeting with China's Commerce Minister, the meeting with the Vice Premier saw both Apple CEO and the government official committing to Apple's participation in developing the country's digital economy and high-tech supply chain. There were plenty of other meetings had, it seems. The South China Morning Post piece says Mr. Cook also met with the head of China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology as well as the chairman of the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade. If you're wondering when this trip will end, you're not the only one. The South China Morning Post says the end date of the CEO's latest China tour and the rest of his agenda are unknown. Disappointed by the lack of new Macs this fall? Well, hold on a moment. Bloomberg's Mark Gurman says there's reason to expect something new in the line before the end of this month, which ends in a little over a week. Engadget had a look at Gurman's Power On newsletter over the weekend that had sources close to Apple saying a Mac launch is in the works for this month. Reading the tea leaves, i.e. current retail supplies and shipping dates for certain models, Mr. Mark thinks the world could be looking at something new in an iMac, as well as the possibility of new MacBook Pros. We'll find out in the next 8 days. There was another interesting hardware rumor that hit over the weekend, about which I had heard a tiny bit a few weeks back. On Saturday, 9to5Mac ran a piece about pictures that seemed to show a HomePod with an LCD screen on top. According to the report, the Apple prototype collector known as Kosutami shared images of components from an unreleased HomePod on Saturday, and interestingly, there's a large touchscreen sensor at the top with a much larger area than the current HomePod panel. Then, Kosutami shared a photo of a prototype HomePod that has a fully functional LCD display on top. 9to5Mac says it was able to verify the legitimacy of these images through some of its own sources. The piece says Apple has not decided whether to release or shelve the device, though the site says it is currently under active development. Now, I was surprised to see this turn up over the weekend, though not totally surprised. That is thanks to an email from Chris in the UK. Chris wrote to me almost 3 weeks ago now, saying not sure if this is something that has been commented on already by people, but I noticed that HomePod gives the game away about its future screen update. I asked it, play the movie score to the film Superman, and it replies, some options are on the screen. It doesn't have a screen. Well, yet, obviously. So writes Chris in the UK, quite possibly ahead of the curve. More news in a moment, but first a word from today's sponsor, Green Chef, the #1 meal kit for eating well. If you've tried HelloFresh, this is them, but different. Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh, bringing you a bigger selection of meal plans from which to choose. Great meal plans. I went with the Mediterranean menu when I signed up and was treated to some amazing flavors, like their chicken with basil pesto. Came with all the ingredients and illustrated step-by-step instructions to make a meal the whole family loved. And we have a seriously picky eater in the house. But Green Chef meals don't just taste good. It's food you can feel good about. Each recipe is nutritionist approved, featuring clean ingredients with no artificial colors, sweeteners, or high fructose corn syrup. Each has limited added sugar and limited processed ingredients. And so much flavor. With 8 meal preferences from which to choose and over 80 options each week, I'm sure you will find food you will love. Go to greenchef.com/60MOK and use code 60MOK to get 60% off plus free shipping. That's greenchef.com/60MOK and use code 60MOK to get 60% off plus free shipping. Every Green Chef meal I've had has been delicious. See what you think. Use code 60MOK to get 60% off plus free shipping at greenchef.com/60MOK. With the next round of OS updates from Apple expected today or tomorrow, Apple ended the week last week running another release candidate up the flagpole. Mac Rumors says the Cupertino crew seeded a second release candidate of iOS 17.1 to developers on Friday. Interestingly, the piece doesn't say anything about a release to the public testing program. Additionally, it says the second release candidate is limited to iPhone 15 models and won't be available for download on other devices. Speaking of iPhone 15 models, I told you folks that I was getting one of those, thanks to the good people at American Tech Support. Well, it got here. My titanium blue iPhone 15 Pro Max actually arrived a little over a week ago. While I don't do a tenth of what the phone's capable of, I can tell you a couple of improvements that I notice frequently. They're tied to the camera and the speed. The 5x optical zoom is crazy. I'm able to get shots that are close up without blocking the light on the thing I'm trying to shoot. The built-in macro lens is pretty cool too, though the automatic switching is a bit jarring at times. As for the speed, I have a very simple shortcut set up. I photograph every letter and postcard I send out, and I send out at least a couple a week. The shortcut I have set up opens the camera, then sends the pic I snap to an album in Photos just for correspondence. On my iPhone 13, took a couple of seconds. On my iPhone 15 Pro Max with the A17 Pro processor, it's as fast as opening the camera app. Anyway, I dig it. Thought I'd let you know. It turns out Apple will not be anchoring a troubled Toronto retail site. Apple Insider says the Cupertino company has backed out of The One. According to the report, The One is an 85-story skyscraper that's been under construction since 2016. Nearly 6 years ago, the world found out that Apple had plans for a 9,000 square foot store to anchor that complex. This past February, 5 years after that revelation, Apple threatened to pull out of the project if certain landmarks and conditions were not met. They were apparently not met because Apple is out. The piece cites a report from iPhone in Canada indicating that Apple took its actions after the project fell into bankruptcy because of a massive $1.6 billion debt, as well as construction delays. And finally today, if you've got CarPlay or Android Auto, statistically you're probably just listening to the radio anyway. That is the latest from Edison Research. 9to5Mac highlights the firm's findings. According to those, for people who have neither CarPlay nor Android Auto, 67% of time spent listening is listening to AM or FM radio, 12% is spent listening to Sirius XM, 9% is spent on streaming services like Apple Music, 4% is spent listening to podcasts, yay, and 8% is spent listening to other. I can't help wondering whether other is CDs, cassettes, or 8-track tapes. As for people with CarPlay or Android Auto, 46% of time spent listening is listening to the radio, for crying out loud. 19% is spent listening to Sirius XM, 18% is spent on streaming services like Apple Music, 7% is spent listening to podcasts, yay! And 10% is spent listening to other. Books on tape, maybe. macOS Can, brought to you by me, and sponsored by Green Chef. Go to greenchef.com/60MOK and use code 60MOK for 60% off plus free shipping. This show is also supported by people like you, patrons through Patreon. Find out more and add your support at patreon.com/macoscan. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media. Online at backbeatmedia.com. You can reach me a couple of ways. info@macoscan.com or call 716-780-4080. Until next time, that is news from macOS Ken. I'm Ken Ray.
Ciao.